data within an organization seeks to mitigate risk, plan for business continuity, and realize compliance with today's regulations, and that is backups. This has been a technology domain that has evolved immensely over the past few years. Many organizational leaders are at an inflection point where IT risk mitigation is accompanied by mandatory compliance, cost control, and better use of human capital. The question stands, what modern backup strategies are available, and how can one qualify those in today's market? The landscape of backups has evolved, as mentioned, in line with many cloud and service management platforms, leveraging many attributes of as-a-service modern offerings. Furthermore, the age of big data and the variety of end-user devices producing data has manufactured the age of big backups. There's 3 house cleanings I want to cover before we start. One is, please send your questions through the interface on your screen, as we will answer them at the end of the event, while keeping the webinar to 60 minutes. Secondly, for anyone in attendance, we will follow up with the white paper by the author John Moyles that provides further details on the material discussed. And finally, he will also, there's also an offer for John to personally follow up with anyone with additional or detailed questions. My name is Mike Bank. I'm the Vice President of the Managed Services Group for Synoptek. John Moyles will be our presenter. John is Synoptek's Senior Solution Architect. He has experience spanning over 25 years with domain expertise within IT service management, disaster recovery, business continuity, and IT architecture. He's also the author of the white paper mentioned before that will be extended to everyone that has attended. John speaks to us today within Synoptek, which is a global consultancy for enterprises holding 20 years of experience. We are constantly asked by customers about the current state of backups, while further assessing for clients the evolution of technology platforms and providing relevant technology-neutral advice. We've seen backup platforms among various vendors rise and fall in terms of capability, as well as the adaptability to the marketplace requirements today. We look forward to sharing our findings today with you and hope you will come away with the objectives noted in the following agenda. First of all, insight into today's enterprise backup challenges and goals. Secondly, modern backup solutions that encompass the new era of comprehensive coverage, versatility, risk management, and cost control. Third, covering a few real-life pragmatic scenarios associating these solutions. And finally, advice on success factors to evaluate and choose the right platform. And with that, I want to introduce John.
Thank you, Mike. So we'll start off with something a little lighthearted, which is a little attention getter. What do hard drives and gerbils have in common? On average, they both live for about 3 to 4 years. Now, that might be a little unfair to gerbils, but there's a truth in that in which data hardware, servers, storage, networks all fail over time. And we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about how to mitigate these kinds of risks. But this conversation today is not going to be about all the things that you should already know being inside this industry. Backups are important, what you should be backing up, potentially where and when you should be backing those things up as well. We're going to concentrate more on state of current industry, new solutions like backup as a service, some examples about how that works, and as Mike alluded, we'll talk about potential providers and solutions. So we'll start with the basic premise, a singular truth about data, that data is the core and the heart of every enterprise out there today. It is the container in which you keep everything, your analytics, your HR, financials, your IP, correspondence, mail, everything. And without that data, no company can survive. It may seem like a blinding glimpse of the obvious, but when you talk about data management, that's the premise, the foundational element you have to start with. And if we accept that as a foundational element, then there are 3 requirements of managing data. You have to be able to store the data, which is on your local hard drive, storage arrays, and the cloud. And we're not going to talk about that today, but we're going to talk about the next 2 things, which is you need to accurately and consistently back up that data, and just as importantly, be able to recover that lost data at a granularity level that you require from an entire system, a site, a server, a file, a database record, a mail record, those types of things. Now, against that singular truth and the three requirements of data management is counterbalanced by another truth in the IT industry. Everything changes. Bigger, better, stronger, faster. Moore's Law is still completely in effect for compute and for storage. And as Mike alluded to, there is an age of big data where we're storing a lot more so that we can crunch data in new and interesting ways for business analytics, intelligence, that kind of stuff. And if there's an age of big data, then it also means there must be an age of big backup as well to accommodate the retention of that information. So as we go through the deck today, we're going to use construction as a metaphor to talk about how you build things up from foundational elements and you build a house and a frame and all these things that make it work. But even though we're using construction as a metaphor, this really backup, it's a blinding glimpse of the obvious, applies to every market vertical. So we'll jump right into the second section. Challenges faced out there in the industry today. And the first major challenge is that planning, building, and maintaining an in-house backup solution is very difficult. Not just because that the technology is complicated, but that backup requires, much like storage, not what you're trying to do today, but what you're going to need to accommodate tomorrow. And future-proofing backup solutions, in-house data backup solutions, is incredibly difficult. If you look back on how the industry's evolved just in the last 5 to 10 years, we now have a plethora of end-user devices that didn't exist or weren't, or marginal, or weren't accepted by the enterprise. Tablets, smartphones, those types of devices have really changed how organizations have to look at their data needs and their backup needs. Bring your own device on end-user devices is also another seismic shift that a lot of organizations haven't really figured out how to accommodate properly yet. So designing a solution that's predictable, stable, and is cost-effective is really a challenge. And so if you look at your backup strategy, you should always be evaluating, is an in-house solution really what you want to be doing right now? Other challenges include the constantly changing landscape. And this includes things, not just the mobile devices and servers I just talked about, but people now have to back up across the enterprise, across different sites. And that can be a challenge. A lot of companies are caught in a situation where the backups are being done local, even though those backups and the data on it can have global consequences for the organization as a whole. Continued spend. You're caught in a cycle constantly of having to refresh your hardware every 3 to 6 years. You have to update the software, which changes almost on a yearly cycle from some backup vendors. And that requires licensing, support contracts, and you have to keep your staff trained up on that software and how to execute on it properly, and best practices. So you're caught in this never-ending cycle of money bleeding out of the company to deal with backups. And the staffing is, I talked a little bit about not having the right people in the right place. Inadequate staffing is a challenge for a lot of organizations. Backup, design, and execution and maintenance has become a specialized field, much like storage has become a specialized field in the IT industry. A lot of organizations just really can't afford that level of staff. Or if they have that level of staff, they wear a couple hats. Maybe it's your network engineer, plus he's also your backup engineer. And so anytime that you have a problem with your backups or you need to reinvigorate the backup process, you've got to take your network engineer out of line to accomplish that. So your primary missions, the things that you're accountable to the organization for, those deadlines have to slip. And that leads to another problem, which is consistency of execution. So if you don't have the right engineers in place that are actively managing, maintaining, and testing those policies, that could put you in a bad place. But a lot of shops also just simply don't run a 24/7 EOC. They're in a situation where their engineers work like everybody else, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. So most backups are run at night and at weekends. And if there's an issue, generally those things can be unresolved and aren't remediated until the following day or even after the weekend. And that's a challenge for companies that have compliance requirements. There are things like HIPAA require certain levels of data to be backed up and protected. And if you're not doing that, you're not able to execute on that properly, or you simply don't have the architecture that allows you to meet those security controls, then that puts you in a tough place. Another thing that's evolved in the last decade or so is that federal and state governments have legal frameworks now about data retention and how long you need to hold things for a compliance and discovery request. And if your software and your infrastructure is not up to speed, maybe you have a discovery request for a user's mailbox or a certain time frame of those users' messages, or potentially even messages to certain people or certain specific messages. If your backup infrastructure can't accommodate those discovery requests where you're forced to potentially restore an entire mailbox or even the entire mail database, that's going to cost you a great deal of money to parse that data out, or you may end up handing over more information than you need to in discovery, which no organization really wants to do. Now, other challenges, there are a lot of other challenges, but mostly we're going to cover that in the white paper. Things like governance, geographic issues, organizational focus on backups from senior management all the way down to IT departments, challenging internal requirements that are hard to meet, and there when you need it, which I mean where backups are being stored, off-siting and getting them back on in a timely fashion, and whether it's being comprehensively tested. So that leads us into the first poll.
Thank you, John. As you mentioned, this is going to be our first poll of the webinar, and in the poll that should be populating on your screen here, there it is. We summarized the list of key challenges presented by John and want to obtain your feedback. So if everyone could click on any of the presented challenges that are on the screen and let us know. We'll give you about 15 more seconds here to identify which are the key challenges. Okay, we see the polls coming in, and almost everybody has voted, just waiting for a couple more. Okay, let's see the results. They're populating. Okay. Okay, interesting. So a couple takeaways here. Many of you still find the effectiveness and reliability of the backup platforms today still a hurdle. Also, secondly, looks like there's an ever-growing need for compliance and regulatory obedience that's required for your data management. Third, and not a surprise either, cost control. It's always and still at the top of the radar. It's also interesting that many of the stakeholders also see a need to address other devices besides the conventional platforms such as SANs, NASs, that are out there. But then there's also the advent of end user and BYOD. Looks like some folks have gravitated to that, while also being able to back up to diverse targets for resiliency. Okay, so just as there are material challenges in today's landscape, there's also a number of key objectives to address tomorrow's changing landscape and requirements. John, can you talk a little bit more about these?
Absolutely. All right, so goals for effective backups. And this is regardless of whether it's a backup as a service, it's an in-house, or another type of outsourcing. This is things you should be looking for regardless of the specific type of solution. Risk mitigation should be at the top of your list. So obsolescence avoidance is a big thing. You buy hardware, you buy software, you have to keep that up to date at all time. If you're going with an outsourced vendor, you want to make sure that responsibility falls on them and that they keep up with it. Compliance with regulatory requirements. Again, these are some of the challenges that we talked about before, but these are the things you need to overcome. Operational continuity at all times, rapid recovery, 24/7 incident response, and data transfer security. And with the data transfer, you want to make sure that the data is protected from the very second it's picked up by the backup software on that device, through whatever transport it's going through, and then finally when it's at rest on the far side and whatever the target storage is going to be. Other things to look for, or other goals to make sure that you're achieving, make sure that you understand the total cost of ownership. What is the hardware, software maintenance cost over term, over that first year startup through that third year, fifth year, sixth year? Make sure that you have accurate projections inside of that. Understand your labor costs to manage that across a single site, multiple sites, whatever your scenario is. If you're a company that's moving to an operational model, then obviously capital expenditures are something that you want to avoid. So you need to structure your solution to match that. And again, not just on that initial rollout, but as you go through refresh cycles and have to upgrade potentially for newer types of platforms, newer capabilities. And you want to understand what it costs to scale for growth. So if you acquire a company or you end up storing more data than you were before because of new initiatives, whatever solution you put into place, is it flexible enough to move up to that next level of storage and potentially recovery speed as well. Accountability, very important as well. Make sure that you have a staff that is as dedicated as can be, has the right expertise, is available 24/7. Again, most backups happen off hours. So if your backup engineers aren't around, then your problems flow into the next day and you're further at risk. Understand what you have from a service level, and if you're going to outsource that technology or this particular solution, make sure that provider gives you service level guarantees. Not only here are our obligations under a service level agreement, but here's how, if we fail, here are the guarantees and the penalties for failing, whether this be financial, contract renegotiation, whatever those clauses may be. Understand how. Make sure that that there's a proven process underneath that orderly in this context means that everybody understands their roles and responsibilities at all times, from management down to the individual engineers that have to interface with the backup technology. Understand and make sure that your solution is predictable, that there's a service assurance, that results are verifiable. We're backing up, we can get the testing done, and that speaks to the next item, regular and uniform testing. Not that you're just testing this occasionally, oh, we set it up, we tested it, we know it works, and we move on. Backup systems, like any other system in IT, grow up organically. You start with system A, and by the time it's ready to be retired or refreshed or reinvigorated, you're on system, D, E, F, those types of scenarios. So testing is something that you need to do on a regular cycle. There's a saying in IT that a backup without a test plan, a regularly tested test plan, it's just a hope. You hope it's there when you need it, but you really don't know. And that's about as close as we're going to sell fear on this particular webinar, but the testing really is critical. Understand that you have trustworthy snapshots, and this speaks to granularity of backups. If you need backups restored quickly, you need to have a scheme that has available points in which you can roll back to easily enough. Again, dependable restoration and reliability. And reliability is a multi-headed animal, best-of-breed platform, trained staff, all those elements. That the solution is comprehensive, that it supports your end-user appliances and as well as critical systems, so storage arrays, NASs, servers, as well as end-user devices. That it can understand and deal with disparate geographical targets be backed up. This is important for enterprises that may only have one office, or businesses that only have one office, but may have their data stored at a data center, local to that office, at a partner site or a partner company, third-party vendor, or even out in the cloud. Your backup solution needs to be able to wrap those all up and encompass all of those. Understand various types of repository and policies, incremental snapshots. It's a little bit technical. I'm not going to dive too much into that. Should be by default, understand selected backup windows against those policies. And deal with multiple media types, the target side of the business. Is it going to tape? Is it disk to disk? Is it cloud? Is it some flavor of both? Is it being copied or aux copied off into multiple destinations? All right, so those are the goals you should look for, which leads us into the second poll.
Thank you, John. And the poll that should also be populating on the screen here shortly, and there it is. We summarized the list of key goals presented by John and want to obtain your feedback. So if everyone could take a few seconds here, what are your top goals with your backup solution in mind today, and more importantly in the future? What are those items that you want to make sure are included in your backup platform or the methodology in your backup processes and execution? Looks like the votes are coming in. I'll give this about 5 more seconds. Okay, a couple more folks are populating right now. All right, let's close the poll and let's look at the results. Okay, so there's not many surprises here. A couple observations. The majority of those on the poll selected most of the attributes as must-haves, and as we look forward to the requirements today and tomorrow's backup platform, it's also to note that each of these items voted upon is an actual attribute of the rapidly evolving and versatile backup platform that we're going to cover here in the next section, and that is backup as a service. And so this is really going to be the meat and the heart of the discussion. John will now cover the essential elements of backup as a service and the considerations to confirm that this is a qualified solution for an organization. John?
Thanks, Mike. All right, so we're going to go through some definitional work on backup as a service, talk about the flexibility of it, and then move through some scenarios, determine if it's a fit, and if it's a fit, what you look for in providers. So we'll start right now. So what is backup as a service? In simplest terms, it allows you to move some or all of your costs, responsibilities, potentially infrastructure, outside, away from your organization to a party who then manages and provides those elements. And that allows you, it's basically an as-a-cloud offering, and it's hard, but a good backup as a service offering should be flexible enough to even run on your local stated hardware if you need local copies, back it up to data centers or whatever. But the key of backup as a service is that the responsibilities and the core costs of maintaining that equipment, training, expertise, shift away from your organization out to the provider, who is then on the hook to continually, reliably, and comprehensively provide these services to your organization. And so, in essence, that future-proofs the solution. You no longer have to deal with that issue. That's always on the provider to keep that current, to accommodate that newest technology that your users, your IT department, your management is bringing in-house to your organization. There's also a great side benefit, which immediately opens the door to their backup engineers and specialists, making those available to your company for architecting, building new systems and backup solutions for your various environments. The one of the things you want to look for in a backup as a service, really the key component is flexibility. And again, not to reuse the phrase, or maybe I am, but it's a blinding glimpse of the obvious. You cannot have a solution that forces you into a box. Your needs and requirements are different than any other business out there, across all the enterprises out there. So your solution, the solution that you need, and the vendors that you have, that needs to be flexible, needs to be aligned. And not as an afterthought to the design, but as a core part of that solution. Your provider needs to understand out of the box, and that their solution needs to be built to a way that accommodates your needs, and that they're not trying to force the square peg into the round hole. And we're gonna see this diagram a lot, but we thought we'd introduce it a little early. So if we talk about flexibility, the way that we can kind of work flexibility in a way that's concrete is to talk about what backups and restores really have to deal with. At its heart, backup and restores really deal with 5 silos. Starting from the left, source devices, to source locations, to how it's being backed up, what transport, whether it's local network or across an ISP circuit, across a dedicated circuit, out to a target location, which could be your site or a data center, and then onto storage that it finally goes to rest on. And then all these things come together on the target storage, and then what retention policies you want. So when we start talking about flexibility as a construct, we can apply this matrix pretty much in any scenario to figure out if the backup as a solution service can work for you in any particular scenario. So we're going to jump right into scenarios. So we have 3 scenarios here for you today, and we are on time, so we'll be able to run through all of them. The first scenario is a company called Finance Co. So Finance Co. is a San Diego-based firm with a single office that has 2 initiatives going on. First, they're looking to acquire another smaller firm in the same area within the next 12 months. Those talks are just underway. Another issue that they're having is that they have a regulatory requirement from the state of California requiring that an additional copy of their data be backed up. Now, the challenges that they're having is that their current storage solution simply can't do that. They can't accommodate another site nor another target to meet the regulatory requirements. So they're caught in a bind, and basically they cannot wait. They are acquiring a company, and they have a deadline from a state entity that they have to comply to. So if you were to tackle this in-house, you may have to purchase a solution that may be over-provisioned, potentially for the acquisitions equipment that needs to be backed up, that if that doesn't materialize, that's wasted money, or defer that to a secondary CapEx purchase that just sits on the books as part of the M&A costs that nobody wants to see. And you can't wait again because the state of California is forcing you to do a secondary backup. So how would backup as a service potentially solve these issues? So again, if we look at these 5 silos, actually I say 5, but there's actually 6 silos again, then we can basically walk through the solution for this particular vendor. So backing up their source devices, which in this environment we just kind of arbitrarily picked as some Windows servers, some database servers, and some basic end-user devices, workstations and laptops. Backing up to their site, they can back up to the local area network onto their current site. So this basically preps them for whatever change they need to do. So replaces the in-house solution with backup as a service, but really running on their existing hardware. So it avoids the capital expenditure cost. If they already have enough storage to do backups today, then the backup as a service can reutilize that storage, and potentially the service doing that storage to load up the software to do their work. Now, if they do acquire that second company, or when they are forced to align with the state of California's regulatory requirements, it's easy enough at that point to simply add another leg to the solution. In this case, if they acquire that second company, then the backup transport initially would be across a VPN tunnel out to potentially the backup provider onto their cloud storage, whatever retention policy is appropriate. And this conduit also would easily allow both sites to back up off-site as per the state of California's requirements. So this solution starts off by replacing the existing solution, and again, there's a low CapEx or to minimal CapEx investment in this because it's potentially possible to reuse the existing hardware, and it's very easy to expand and scale this environment to that second site or that third site, or that fourth site as this company continues to grow. The next example is Bioinformatics Incorporated. So they're a life sciences company. They're headquartered in New York, and they have satellite offices all across the country. Now, they've set up a network connection that allows all these offices to talk together directly to a point-to-multipoint circuit for both data and voice. Where they run into problems with backup is that each site across the country, including corporate, set up its own IT infrastructure, including backup. Each site is staffed by its own IT people. So corporate data is not really being consistently backed up. And where it is being backed up, it's not being backed up particularly well. Another issue that they had is because the backups really aren't being very tightly governed, is that a former employee basically picked up a backup off another employee's desk, walked out the door with it, and then basically delivered it to another company. So there was a loss of IP. And that's obviously had some bad consequences for this company. So the challenges that this company faces is they've got offices all across the country, but they don't have any central governance. They have inconsistent backups, and that exposes the company because each site has data that's important to the business as a whole. But the corporate doesn't have visibility into that, and they don't know where that data is specifically or how much is at risk. So a potential solution that that backup as a service could offer, again, moving from the 6 silos, is to take all their source devices, again, these are kind of arbitrarily picked, from their multiple sites, using their existing multi-point circuit to back that data up into a provider's cloud, and then get onto provider storage for whatever retention policy they need. Now, one thing the diagram doesn't really show, but would be a good approach for this particular project, is this is not an all-or-nothing scenario. This particular customer could have their backups shifted one at a time, potentially starting with corporate, for example, getting them up to speed and in line with governance and policies, and then every satellite office one at a time, offloading those backup responsibilities and creating that single source of truth for the enterprise as a whole. Backup the data centrally located, Corporate can pull it back down whenever they need to. If they want to open up a new site, potentially that data is already there to help that new site be stood up. The third example is Emergency Response LLC, or ER LLC. So this is a regional player, and they just went through a big M&A cycle, and they bought up a lot of hospitals and clinics in their region. Now, their growth problem is an organic one. They've picked up organizations whose IT infrastructure is whatever the original company had. So that includes departments, equipment that isn't in line with how the enterprise would have built, the business would have built it out of the box. And so now they're caught in a situation where a lot of devices aren't being backed up at all. They just really have no visibility or accountability. And it's going to take quite a while if you were to try to do this in-house to try to inventory all of this, determine which backup solution at which one of these partners, or I'm sorry, newly acquired entities may be the best solution for the corporation as a whole. A lot of challenges and a lot of time spinning that up to speed. And because this is in the healthcare vertical, they've got HIPAA compliance issues, and they cannot spend a ton of time getting this up to speed. So they've got to go challenge. They cannot spend 12, 18 months doing an exploratory project, deciding on a solution. Companies at risk day one, legally, financially, and again, their data is just everywhere and puts them in a bad place. So a potential solution, again, thinking about BaaS, 6 silos, is a 2-phased approach. So, and I apologize, I did skip one important part here. I'm going to flip back just 3 slides to talk about one important element that would make this a 2-phase solution. The company is going to put in an MPLS circuit, a multi-point circuit that will connect all these sites together, a dedicated circuit that will hook these sites together. But they haven't even ordered it yet. And that's going to be a challenge for this organization, because anybody who's ever dealt with circuit provisioning knows that 30, 60, 90, 120 days are not unusual amounts of time before that circuit is hot and it can actually be used. And they simply can't wait that long. So a 2-phase solution for backup as a service would be phase 1, use the existing circuits. And so this is a more complicated example. The customer has a lot of different source devices, including smartphones, desktops, Macs, Linux, Windows devices, and they've got data stored in a lot of places. They've got it in the data center, some it's hung out in a third-party cloud, some it's stored locally at each one of these new acquisitions. So they'll use whatever circuit's available to back the data up. If there's a dedicated circuit, for example, on this particular example, from the data center, that particular data center already has a point-to-point circuit to the provider. So we'll back up across that. It's dedicated. For other circuits, we only have ISP circuits in place. So potentially you can set up VPN tunnels across those general ISP circuits and then back up into the provider's cloud as well. Yes, it's not optimal because it eats up your ISP bandwidth. Rather, it can eat it up pretty badly. But it is a valid option, and it's a way to get the backups moving much faster than an in-house and organically grown project. And this particular example, just to kind of show the flexibility of a backup as a solution service, the provider will take that backup, keep a copy locally for 2 weeks, and then throw a copy out to a third-party cloud, Amazon, Rackspace, Azure, whatever, for a 12-month retention. So phase 1, use the service you have available day 1. Phase 2 is when that multi-point-to-multi-point MPLS circuit is finally put in and provisioned and accessible by the different hospitals, data centers. Then start using that. And because it's a flexible solution, it's mostly a matter of just repointing the transport, and it's not a terribly difficult change to make after the fact. It's not, you're not reinvesting equipment or hardware, network stack, any of that type of stuff. So again, flexibility in your solution is going to be key. And not just because of what's on this page today, because there will be new things on this page tomorrow. There'll be new backup providers, there'll be new third-party providers, there'll be new types of devices out there that you'll have to account for. So, looking at these 6 silos, you mentally put yourself and think, well, how do I get from the left to the right? And would that meet my solution today? And then what do I have to think about to meet tomorrow? If I build an in-house solution, what extra pieces would I need to snap in to make all of that work? And again, is that really worth it? So if backup as a service, the flexibility is appealing to you, then the next thing to do is to dig into, is it a fit for every other element that you're looking for? So we'll start with scale. If you're in a situation where the growth of your data is going to exceed your ability to back things up, and you're caught in a situation where you've maxed out that storage unit, you've maxed out the number of shelves, wherever you're in, backup as a service could be an easy operational way to get yourself out of that trap. Obsolescence. Again, if you're raised or obsolescent, your software has gotten too old, it can't deal with more modern devices, it can't deal with backing up things out of the cloud or to multiple sites, that's also a challenge as well. Corporate growth, we gave a couple examples of that, M&As, or just organic growth. Your company's growing, you're spinning up new offices, new users, new systems to accommodate a growing company. If your backup solution can't keep up pace with that, or it's expensive to do so, BaaS could be a good fit. If you've changed your IT investment strategy, well, a lot of organizations now are frowning on capital expenditures for IT purchases. They'd rather make an operational expense model. It's more predictable for them. It lowers that upfront cost. It makes it easy to budget over term. And it's the really big one for me, which is a no single source of truth. And I really like the graphic on the right on this one. If you've got disparate backup systems at different sites, which one do you really want to use if you want to decentralize? If you need to pull backups from one site, could you actually restore that on another piece of hardware? You want the one singular hammer that works in every place that you want to use that tool. Not a bunch of tools that are close but really can't work together to do the same jobs. Accountability is obviously key, as we saw in the poll. If you can't meet your internal and external requirements for backup, then potentially your job's at risk, your company's at risk, your data's at risk. You want to deal with risk mitigation, and the context for this one is, how do you get your data offsite securely, and how do you bring it back in, and do that such in a way that's in a timely fashion? Maintenance, kind of this picture kind of shows it. Burdensome, complicated license support agreements. It's very hard these days to figure out if you're in licensing compliance with anything. So much software has so many different types of options and scenarios that it can be really easy to follow the line and not realize it until after the fact. So if BaaS lines up with those previous slides, and it seems like it's a good fit, then the next thing you want to do is evaluate a provider that can provide it to you in a way that aligns with your business needs. And first, most critical, it's 1, 2, and 3 up front. You need a partner. You do not need a faceless vendor who's going to sell you a solution that fits in a box. They just send you a bill every month. Backups are incredibly important. If the singular truth about data is that you can't live without it, then you got to have solid backups, you've got to have solid recovery, and you need a partner that you can trust to make sure that that happens and can prove and is accountable to those scenarios of backup policies that you can get that data back when you need it. Other factors you want to look for, they're accountable. They maintain a direct relationship with you. A good way to see that that's happening and working is make sure they have a designated advisor. Somebody you can call up, somebody whose name you know, hopefully a person that you've met. You're putting a lot of trust in this company. It's not really something you just want to order at a self-provisioning website. The company is focused on backup as a service. This is another key and critical success factor. If the company does this as a me too, as an add-on, they're white labeling somebody else's service, they're not really focused on it. And quite frankly, they have all the same problems you do. They don't have dedicated backup engineers. Backup is something they throw bodies at when they have a problem, but otherwise it's something they just kind of do on the side. Make sure your provider treats data securely at all times, from start to finish. That it's not something they pay lip service. Oh yeah, we do encryption. You want to ask some hard questions about what that is and what that looks like. From the source to the transport to the destination. That they're sensitive to your compliance requirements. HIPAA, PCI DSS, all the things, IRS 1075, all the things that are out there today that you have to align your security and administrative controls to. Not only do they understand it, but they actually, again, they work with it on a daily basis. They have customers in that space already. They understand all the pitfalls of those compliance requirements. Other good factors, I'm going to go through this a little faster. Reach. Make sure this provider can back up and restore to the places that you're at. It doesn't help if you pick a local player who doesn't really can't help you across the nation, or if you're international across the world. State of the art. Make sure that they maintain best practices, best process, solid infrastructure, best-of-breed software, and well-trained engineers and staff. And that's just not the engineers, but that's also the account managers, management in general that drives and understands the process. Work with a vendor or provider who gives you utility fee structure. If you're going to move to an operational model, don't buy in capacity. Pay for what you consume in backup. Make sure that the backups are predictable. And on your earlier poll, this was a very important item for a lot of you. Make sure that it's monitored and managed 24/7. In other words, again, don't buy a solution that emulates how your shop does business today. If you're 9 to 5, having a 9 to 5 backup provider doesn't really add a lot of value. Make sure that they have robust and comprehensive logging analytics. So if there is an issue, that it's understood and that it's addressed in a timely fashion. Make sure the solution is comprehensive. Includes full support for your environment, whether that's backing up storage arrays, NASes, servers, mobile devices, any kind of end user support. Make sure that they have strong operating system support natively for your environment, for whatever operating systems you run, so that it can do comprehensive backups. Other factors to look for that I go into more depth on the white paper: is it scalable? Is it transparent? Is it granular enough on backups and on restores? Is it efficient? And by efficient, I mean, do they do things like dedupe, compression, so that you don't have to buy oversized tunnels to do backups, and that restores can be done in a much faster fashion. So, in conclusion, the simple truth of data, again, is that you cannot live without it. So, but the challenge with that, the counterbalance to that, is that everything always changes. So your IT strategy, your backup strategy, is something that you're always going to have to evaluate. And it's always going to be an ongoing assessment, and you're going to have to make it a priority. If you care about your data, then you have to care about the backups and the recovery as much. So the most important question you're going to face with backup data management is, does your solution meet the goals and challenges that you or your organization currently face? If not, then hopefully this webinar is giving you the tools and armed you with enough information where you can go out there and start asking questions and evaluate vendors, providers in an intelligent fashion. And so this leads us into the Q&A portion of the event. So we've got a few questions, and Mike will read them out to me.
Yeah, thanks, John. And thanks to everybody. There's been a couple questions that have rolled in throughout the presentation. So John, I'll direct these to you. The first one, how does backup as a service provider solution cost compared to an in-house solution?
Okay, fair question. So an in-house solution, we've spent a few slides talking about this already. In-house solutions have to deal with not only the capital expenditure to bring the hardware and the initial software purchase in-house, but then there's the operational cost you have to deal with supporting that infrastructure, supporting the licenses and contracts on the hardware and on the software, and the engineering expertise. So those things are costs you're going to have to bear throughout the contract. And some of that's capital, some of that's operational. And every 3, 4, 5, 6 years, you're in a situation in which you are going to have to refresh that hardware and potentially refresh that software as well. And every time that happens, then you're going to have to train your engineers again on how to use that equipment, that software, new policy strategies, those types of things. And so internally, that can be quite a burden for an organization that might rather spend, reallocate those types of costs to have their engineers do more, I don't want to say interesting projects, but projects more aligned with the corporate vision, more strategic efforts, instead of dealing with the backup solutions. Where if you move to the operational model of backup as a service, then all of that stuff streamlines down. Hardware refreshes, training, all those things basically boil away from your organization, become part of the provider's responsibilities, and then you have a predictable cost model underlying all of that that lets you know, on your P&Ls what your pricing model is and what you can expect to spend on backup on a consistent basis over time.
Okay. Another one that just came in, how are you actually protecting the backup as a solution from a natural disaster?
So that could be a complicated question, but I'll boil it down to the simplest scenario. We'll go back to finance go. If you're backing up locally, then your backup data is generally pretty close to your core data, and that's always at risk. So if you're going on a solution where the backup as a service is flowing that data out to a secondary to site, then that could potentially be geographically disparate. And if it's not, then, and that's a critical issue for you, your backup provider should be able to throw it into another circumstance, another store that they have, or potentially a third-party cloud that is geographically disparate from that site. And so almost, I don't want to say natively, but in a lot of cases, backup as a service is going to provide a bit of offsite. Now, disaster recovery, getting that, of an entire site and getting that data back and talking about recovery rings and those types of things is definitely a topic for another webinar, because disaster recovery is an adjunct to backup as a service or even an in-house solution that requires integrating with it, but it really is its own standalone solution needs to be set up.
Thanks, John. All right, here's a question from John. How much of a trade-off in RTO, which is recovery time objective, so the amount of time to actually recover data back to systems, how much of a trade-off in RTO is there when comparing BaaS solution versus an on-premise solution?
Great question, and I probably should have covered this more in depth in the webinar. So it's completely dependent on the solution. If you have time objectives where you need to be able to recover in minutes or seconds, then part of the BaaS solution's flexibility is, and I'm going to flip back a few slides here, and I'm just going to leave myself on this one. One of the things that can happen in a backup as a recovery solution is one of the target locations can be the same site. So one of the things that can happen with BaaS is that an initial backup that maybe, again, only has like a 6-hour retention or a 5-day retention is kept locally for those types of policies, servers, files, databases that have an incredibly high RTO, potentially measured in seconds, are kept locally, so those can be thrown back out as quickly as possible, but everything else is then being backed up through that box out into a provider cloud, third-party cloud, data center, wherever that target storage is. So there's flexibility there to work with in type of those elements. Also, again, I talked a little bit about the ability to be efficient. I made it just a bullet, and I didn't talk a lot about it, but your BaaS provider solution should do decompression and deduplication of backups. And if you have that local server, there is kind of a way to, I want to say game the system, that's kind of a negative, but there's a way to do even the offsite recoveries a bit faster if the data is in what's called a known pattern. So short answer is it can be as equivalent or even better if you need it to be than an in-house solution. You're not sacrificing that by going to BaaS, but it will require, if you have very high requirements, it will potentially require some additional equipment on site. Again, in an operational expenses model, your provider should be able to amortize that and kind of roll it into their costs as well.
So it sounds like that's a disk-to-disk solution when it's on site, and so that recovery time is minutes, if you will. And then if it's a catastrophic issue, then there is geographical diversity, and then it's pushed to the cloud with deduplication. So you're covered with all different types of disasters that could occur. Is that right, John?
Absolutely. And if you have, let's say you have terabytes of data, you only need a small percentage of that to be immediately stored, then you don't have to have the expense of an enormous amount of hardware storage locally. Again, BaaS has the flexibility to say, we're just keeping this subset, the smaller subset, on local disk, but the larger subset finds a different home.
So here's another question that I think is this one comes up a lot from our clients, and as a segue, you talked about backing up data into the cloud, and a lot of folks know that there are options in the cloud. There are private cloud environments and there are public cloud environments. This question is, how is my data encrypted? And can you address this not only over the wire, but also where it's data at rest?
Sure. So the encryption should start, again, it depends on the provider, but in general what you should be looking for is a solution that can actually, when it's picking up the data off of the server, encrypts it there before it even hits the first transport wire. And that's important because the backup solution should be pretty agnostic to what the transport is. And if it's picked it up and encrypted it already, then the transport, if it's not secure, while at risk, isn't a catastrophic risk. Then the transport itself can be encrypted. Everybody knows about VPN technology, so you can add an extra layer of encryption there. And then on the target side, that data is dropped in encrypted as well. So, and on the encryption front, you're looking for a vendor who does very good key management. And there's different scenarios. The vendor can hold on to the keys so they can do restores on demand for you. If you're a company that basically that's not allowed through compliance or internal requirements, then you could be in a situation where you hold on to the keys. Vendor still backs them up, but doesn't have basically the recovery side of the key. And therefore, if you need recovery, then you can provide that key or use an interface basically to designate what needs to be restored.
Good. Here's another one. Can you also back up configuration from network devices, switches and firewalls? I know we talked about servers and SANs, and you talked briefly about mobile devices, but what about other core infrastructure that companies are providing backups of their operating systems and/or their scripts, etc.?
That's a fair question. So backing up network devices is something that a lot of backup software still doesn't target very well, but there are monitoring tools that do a very good job at it. So it does depend again on your provider, but it's definitely a question you should ask. Can I reach in and pick up my writing and start a configuration out of network devices? Sometimes the provider can, sometimes they can't. In situations where it's not feasible, the challenge with network devices, sometimes they're kept behind different layers of VLANs, and the visibility on them can be pretty hard. Then there sometimes can be intermediary software that will pull that config out, or you can just use, for example, Cisco IOS to back it up directly, and then it's picked up basically on a second pass.
Great. Okay. Those are the questions that we have. John's contact information, we'll put that up here on the screen.
Oh, flew right off the bottom, sorry.
And if anybody has any follow-up questions, there's John's direct contact information. As I mentioned earlier in the webinar, anyone that has attended will receive a copy of the white paper that John discussed. It's also available on our website. And that's it for the webinar. So thank you all very much for attending. Thank you, John. Everyone have a wonderful